Sorry, my internet is a bit unstable, so I kind of dropped off. As I was saying, Ramadan Mubarak to all our Muslim brothers and sisters. So, some of the key updates before we start. One is we'll be reaching out soon to all the AWAC country conveners. The project is being funded by the African Climate Change Fund of the African Development Bank, and it's being implemented in 12 countries, namely Burundi, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Comoros, Kenya, Malawi, Mauritius, Rwanda, Tanzania, South Sudan, Seychelles, and Uganda. So if you're a woman with disability or you work with women with disability and you'd like to be part of the AWAC, kindly reach out, put your name on the chat, and we'll be able to reach out to you in the course of this meeting. At this juncture, allow me to welcome Dr. Patricia Nyunguro, who's a climate scientist and also a principal meteorologist at the Kenya Meteorological Department. And she's also the IPCC focal point for Kenya. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Nyunguro.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you for the invitation to speak to your group. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to share some of what I do with your team, and I hope it can help us to open additional ways that as Africans and as Africans here, we can engage better with the policy and also make our voices heard at the global level. So I have a short presentation, and the theme of it, or the title of it, is Navigating IPCC Pathways for Disability Inclusive Climate Action. And in this presentation, I will basically just be talking about introducing the IPCC, what the IPCC does, and then seeing how we can be able to make sure that disability inclusion is achieved within the IPCC or at different levels. So let me just reshare again. So just give me a minute. All right. Can you let me know that my screen is visible?
Yes, it is.
Is it on presenter view or what view is it on?
It's on presenter view. So we
Okay.
can, yes.
Let me just change it. All right. So very briefly, what the IPCC is, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the founding bodies for the IPCC is the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP, which is now UN Environment. And it was founded in 1988, almost 40 years ago. And the main purpose of the IPCC is to provide the world with objective, scientific view of climate change, based on assessments that it carries out on the latest state of knowledge on climate change. So basically what that means is that the IPCC, based on agreed on outlines, would review what is the latest science on climate change, both the science, adaptation, and mitigation, and then combine this into assessment reports that are made available for policymakers and for anyone who would like access to them. And there is the website for the IPCC. You can explore it, and perhaps this can be put in chat as well. So it's just if you Google IPCC, you should be able to see it. So basically, what the IPCC does is to provide policymakers mainly with regular scientific assessments on climate change. What are the implications of these changes that are being seen? And what are the potential future risks that are expected? So it does projections up to predetermined times in the future, and then also looks at what are adaptation and mitigation options that are available as a suite of options that policymakers can rely on to be able to safeguard the livelihoods of people, citizens in their individual countries, or if it's at the global level as well, what kind of options are available. So it's very important to note that the IPCC does not conduct its own research, so it does not carry out research, but it merely assesses what research has been done by researchers across the globe. And then the reports are meant to be neutral, are designed to be neutral, and they are policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So the difference there is that the IPCC will not indicate what countries should do, what policies, how policies should be designed, but it provides information that is relevant for policy development. So because of national sovereignty and different issues, it does not provide prescriptive information, but relevant information. So a policymaker can just easily pick an IPCC report up and then design policies bearing in mind the local context. And as well, and very noteworthy is, and I think Cynthia also mentioned this, that the IPCC assessment reports are key input into international negotiations on climate change. For example, the UNFCCC, the COP sessions, the scientific basis is the reports that the IPCC provides. That together with other reports. All right. So this is the structure of the IPCC in brief. We mentioned earlier that the WMO and UNEP are the founding or the parent organizations for the IPCC. Then we have the IPCC plenary, and then we have the IPCC Bureau, the executive committee, and we also have an IPCC secretariat, which tends to the day-to-day running of the work of the IPCC. The plenary of the IPCC is made up. The IPCC plenary is made up of 195 UN members. And so these are governments that are also part of the UN system. And so they automatically become part of the IPCC. And then the IPCC Bureau is made up of elected individuals who are elected from among the countries to represent all the regions within the IPCC. And so this election is done at the end of every assessment cycle. So the IPCC does assessments that lasts, or assessment cycles that last about 5 to 7 years. And at the end of each cycle, the existing bureau is dismantled and then the new bureau is put in place. Currently, the IPCC is in its 7th assessment cycle. So the existing reports or assessments that are available are part of the 6th assessment cycle, and work is being done currently to release the reports for the 7th assessment cycle. So how is the IPCC work organized? So we have the working groups, and so we have working group 1, which provides the physical science basis. I think we'll look at it a bit more in depth going forward. Then we have working group 2, which addresses impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. We have working group 3, which deals with mitigation of climate change. And then we have a task force on national greenhouse gas inventories. And all of these four, the 3 working groups and the task force, are supported by what is called a technical support unit. The working group is made up of vice chairs, 2 co-chairs, one from a developing country and one from a developed country, and then vice chairs of each working group. These are all voluntary positions, and so if one is elected to be a vice chair of the IPCC, it is absolutely on a voluntary basis. However, the technical support units are salaried roles, and they have to take up the job, be based in one place, and they support the day-to-day running of each of the working groups. And then lastly, we have authors, contributors, and reviewers, and these are the ones who actually do the main work of the IPCC, drafting the reports, reviewing the reports, and making sure that they are as robust as possible, and then bring them back into the plenary for approvals. So that's, in short, the structure of the IPCC. Just a little bit in depth into what each of the working groups does. So in working group 1, it mainly examines the physical science that underpins climate change. So it would look at how climate was in pre-industrial times, compare it with after pre-industrial times up to now, and then also look at what it is expected to be like in the future using simulations. And so this provides the scientific basis for everything else. Then working group 2, after having worked on what the climate change looks like, using, for example, temperature as a proxy, working group 2 looks at the impacts of these changes that have been happening. And so it would look at impacts on a sectoral level, on a regional level, and then also propose adaptation options. It will also look at the existing vulnerabilities that are related to climate change. And these vulnerabilities would be, again, sectoral vulnerabilities, regional vulnerabilities, different kinds of vulnerabilities, and then address this in the Working Group 2 report. For the Working Group 3, it is mainly focused on climate change mitigation. So how do we collectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions and even remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere? And so that is the entire focus of Working Group 3. And again, it uses a sectoral approach. So it looks at various sectors that tend to be high emitting, for example, and then looks at how within those sectors we can be able to reduce emissions and how technology can be leveraged as well to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And finally, we have the task force on national greenhouse gas inventories. And what this task force does, it develops methodology and software that allows countries to calculate and report its greenhouse gas emissions. And this is in line with the Paris Agreement, with the global collective goals. And so each country is expected to indicate their emissions on an annual level and also how they plan to reduce those. So in the development of the NDCs, for example. And so the Greenhouse Gas Inventory Task Force is the one that provides this information, and it's meant to be such that it's uniform and it's comparable. So the task force provides guidance for countries to measure their greenhouse gases at different tiers. And this will be based on the capability of every country and how much data countries also collect. So some countries have capacity to collect more data than others, and therefore they use a relatively higher tier of reporting than others. So it provides all those so that no country is burdened in provision of its greenhouse gas emissions, and also calculating removals and also planning for reduction in future, and then highlighting them in their nationally determined contributions. So basically, that's the IPCC very briefly and what it does. Now, coming to our topic for today, how can we ensure that global climate pathways meaningfully include persons with disability? And so the figure that I have here shows how, or rather illustrates how can we move from disability exclusion in IPCC pathways to a state where we have disability inclusive climate pathways. And I suggest a number of things there, and mainly the aim is to influence the IPCC processes. So one will be to analyze how climate pathways are developed. And then after analyzing that, we look at where disability is missing. So for example, in the reports of the IPCC for Working Group 1, 2, or 3, where is it possible for us to have inclusion of aspects of disability? And then we improve mitigation and adaptation modeling by incorporating the vulnerabilities that disabilities surface. And finally, it allows us to then influence IPCC processes effectively. So it is important that persons with disability are part of this process, because the context, the local context and in which they operate in is made additionally difficult compared to people who are able, and therefore incorporating design of adaptation and mitigation options that caters to disability is useful in ensuring that society attains resilience as a whole. So just a quick question also to see, why is it important to include disability in climate action? Globally, about 1.3 billion people live with disabilities. That's just a fact. And a lot of the times we, or rather systems and people, only see very minimal visible impacts on people with disability from climate. However, there are hidden depths that people with disabilities face. in dealing with climate or as impacted by climate change. So, for example, we have inaccessible systems. You might find that there are some barriers to early warnings. Information may just be provided maybe in modes that those living without disability can be able to access, but not for others as well. And also information about evacuation, should that become necessary in the case of extreme weather events, may be provided in a way that is not as inclusive as it should be. And therefore, this leads to exclusion in this particular case. Also, supply chain disruptions. So sometimes people living with disabilities may have challenges accessing essential medical supplies because of climate change and the impacts that we see. And therefore, then it impacts how resilient they can be to the changes that climate change presents for different contexts. Then heat sensitivity. So there are those that are extremely or increasingly vulnerable to extreme temperatures. And at times, these may not be noticeable or may not be incorporated in. Can you hear me? I think I got muted by accident.
We can hear you now, but lost you for a minute.
Okay, so I'll just walk back a little. So I was mentioning that people living with disabilities may experience increased vulnerability to extreme temperatures, and perhaps when we are designing early warning for heat extremes, those thresholds may not capture. The thresholds that I used may not capture these specific vulnerabilities. And so these are things that without actually exploring, we might not be able to identify easily as hampers or barriers towards climate action. And then also social production. It's very clear that climate vulnerability is socially constructed. So if systems are developed at the national level or whatever governance levels, for example, that do not include people living with disabilities, then they become extra vulnerable to climate change, the impacts of climate change, and that is a direct consequence of it being socially constructed. Yeah. So people living with disabilities absolutely are disproportionately impacted by changes that we see from climate. And a lot of the time, systems only recognize what is visibly obvious, while there are other hidden depths that are not necessarily identified or seen quite readily. So how do we now embed into the IPCC? I think just looking at the IPCC, the two ways by which we can include, or how does the IPCC work? And then in the next one, we look at, for example, what opportunities exist. So what provides us an opportunity to include people living with disabilities in climate action is the two working groups. So working group one mainly just deals with the science. So it's a scientific basis. So it's observations, it's temperature changes, it's future projections. But in working group two and working group three, where we are looking at mitigation pathways and we are looking at adaptation pathways as well, we have opportunity here to ensure that all capacities are assumed in these pathways. So, for example, going straight into mitigation pathways, how the IPCC frames it is it looks at emission trajectories. It looks at how emissions have been happening in the past, how they are currently, and how they are expected to change as climate change continues, or to influence climate change as well. And then it also looks at energy transitions, how capable are regions, countries, sectors able to transition from fossil fuel energy dependence into cleaner and more renewable energy. It also highlights net zero scenarios. So by when are we likely to have all emissions that are made removed from the atmosphere? So we have a net zero scenario. And then it also looks at carbon removal pathways. So removal directly from the atmosphere, for example, through CDR technologies, using technologies or carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That's on the mitigation side. On the adaptation side, the IPCC would also assess what are some risk reduction strategies, and these would be at a sectoral level and even at a regional level. It would also assess how to avoid maladaptation. And maladaptation simply is implementing adaptation actions that end up being detrimental, or that in some cases even end up to increasing climate change or increasing emissions. So the IPCC would assess that within Working Group 2. And then it will also look at decision thresholds. Within what thresholds are countries, sectors able to make decisions that still safeguard their citizens, lead, for example, to poverty, eradication, but also contribute to the common goals, and sequence adaptation options as well. And so the critical question here becomes, whose capacities are assumed in these pathways? A lot of the time, you will find that inclusion of disability or people living with disability is relatively lower. And looking at where specifically this is included, using the sixth assessment cycle as an example, excuse me, we see that there is very limited integration of issues dealing with disability within the IPCC sixth assessment cycle. Where it exists, it's mainly under the Working Group 2, so mainly looking at adaptation. So it is addressed as a vulnerability factor, and then it is framed, people living with disabilities are framed as needing protection only. It is also included as a social disadvantage and a marker of social inequality. But under mitigation in Working Group 3, there is limited mitigation modeling, so it's not integrated into the climate models, and it's not embedded in socioeconomic scenarios. So scenarios are some of the main ways that the IPCC uses to indicate how emissions are expected to change, what trajectory, particularly into the future. And the lack of inclusion of disability in these socioeconomic scenarios directly fails to capture the lived realities of those living with disability, and collectively contributes to non-achievement or implementation of adaptation and mitigation plans at national level, for example, or even at sectoral level. There is also minimal quantification within the reports because of lack of data, perhaps, and metrics. And there's also limited presence, so they are not in adaptation metrics at all. So the framing of disability within the sixth assessment cycle has been positioned as at risk. So it's mainly being viewed as a vulnerability factor, and how to indicate risk, additional risk, but not as an agent of transformation. And I think our conversation today is mainly to help us see how we can move from it being just a marker of vulnerability, but as agents of transformation and inclusive climate action. This just emphasizes further how the IPCC frames risk and where it falls short a little. So risk, as you would all know, is framed as interaction between the hazard, exposure to said hazard, and the vulnerability. And so the diagram on the left, on the right there, just shows how that happens. So we have the hazard, which could be extreme rainfall or flooding. Then we have the exposure, so people living in flood-prone areas. And then we have vulnerability here, which for our case, we can use disability as the vulnerability. And so disability within the IPCC is usually placed only under vulnerability. But the honest truth is that disability intersects with exposure, for example. So it will determine what areas someone is able to live, what type of housing quality is available, and what are the mobility constraints that this person who is living with disability faces. And therefore, it also is a factor of exposure. And then in adaptive capacity as well, disability intersects with it because then people living with disability have to have access to caregiving networks, for example, and assistive devices or things that improve the quality of their life. And access to these or lack of access to these influences directly their capacity to adapt to the hazards that are being seen increasingly as climate changes. And also institutional response or inclusive planning. So systems rarely especially in developing country contexts, rarely take into account inclusivity in planning. And so what this means is then because disability is only captured in vulnerability, a lot is missed in the other components, and therefore we need to move beyond this very narrow framing, because if we only leave it within the vulnerability, then we only saw people living with disability and their exposure to hazards and how they can contribute to change. So I talked a little bit about the developing country context, and so why does it matter in Africa? Why does it matter? And the main thing here is that disability inclusion is especially urgent in resource-constrained settings. Why is this? If we look at floods as a hazard, for example, because of the level of development, a lot of African countries have slums or informal settlements in which people live, and you find a mix of people in there, including people living with disabilities. And so this adds an extra layer of vulnerability and lack of institutional inclusivity in institutional planning. So when you have a flood-prone area, which is an informal settlement, for example, access to information is relatively lower, but even access of support services to those areas in the presence of a hazard is relatively lowered compared to areas that are not in informal settlements. So this becomes increasingly a challenge, particularly in resource-constrained settings. And then if we look at heat waves as another hazard, in many other parts of the world, when people experience heat, they are able to use or access cooling facilities. So either places where they can have cooling, but also within their own homes, they have ACs, for example, or ways to mitigate the heat. But in resource-constrained settings, that becomes a challenge. You have a divide where you have populations able to access cooling facilities and others not able to access cooling facilities. And so therefore, this adds to the complexity of how to design responses. Then also looking at supply chains, for example, assistive technologies are fragile in resource-constrained settings, and also social protection systems are limited in resource-constrained settings because of competition for different priorities at the national and even subnational level. And so climate change, when it happens, as proxied by these various hazards that we see, it exacerbates vulnerabilities that already exist. So it's a crucial thing within the African context. And so it's important that then we look at how to ensure that these contexts are catered for at the global level. Having said that, just to highlight how many African experts participate within the IPCC, and this becomes important because it's very difficult for someone to capture your perspective if you're not in the room, for example. If you have a specific need and people are discussing their needs, it is very unlikely that someone who does not have your need would advocate for it. And so it's very crucial within the IPCC, for example, at all the levels to ensure that we have African experts. What you're seeing before you is a figure or a representation of how many authors within the sixth assessment cycle came from different parts of the globe. And we see that the highest there was from Europe, and we have 7% from South America. And then we have 11% in Africa and the Southwest Pacific. This is a relatively low number compared to the size of Africa, to the level of diversity that exists within the continent in terms of climate regimes. And therefore, even these 11% authors, it will be difficult for them to capture all perspectives on the continent. But this is an improvement from what was seen in the fifth assessment cycle. So there is an improvement in the number of authors that are participating within the IPCC. And the more we have those who are representative of various contexts, the better the output of the IPCC is in providing information for policymakers at at different levels. So how do we navigate the entry points for inclusivity or inclusion within the IPCC? So one area is by engaging with the national focal points, and this would provide the opportunity to influence the IPCC process, for example, by ensuring that nominations are done in a way that is as inclusive as possible. The IPCC also goes through expert review processes for its reports before they are fully published. And so this is an opportunity for experts who work with people living with disability or themselves are living with disability to review the IPCC reports and identify areas where inclusivity can be strengthened. And then also publishing disability climate research it's also important because, as we mentioned, that the IPCC just assesses existing literature. So publishing peer-reviewed research on the nexus between disability and climate change, not only from a vulnerability point of view, ensures that when the IPCC is looking for material to assess, this is readily available and the authors can pick them up. Also contributing to scoping meetings. So the scoping meetings are what actually decide the outlines for the reports, what will be assessed and how it will be assessed. And so being able to be nominated to take part in the scoping meetings determines how you can shape the work of the IPCC. And so if we have experts living with disability or working with people living with disabilities, then we can be sure that those perspectives are included at the scoping level before the writing of the report starts. Again, there is also an opportunity to submit review comments on draft reports, and that is also very similar to the expert review process. And there you can look out for areas where disability could have been included but was not included, and therefore ensure that those perspectives are captured. And particularly for this cycle of the IPCC, we are working on the development of indicators on metrics for assessing or evaluating adaptation. And so there is opportunity there to advocate for disability disaggregated indicators in climate change reporting or even in assessing progress in adaptation and mitigation as well. So a little bit on what the role of the national focal point is. So because the IPCC is a global body, the focal point who are appointed at the national level become the point of contact between the IPCC and the governments. And part of their role is to prepare and update a list of national experts to help implement the work of the IPCC. And so engaging with your national focal point would allow them to know you and know that you have a certain disability, but are an expert in a certain area that's related to climate change. And so when a call for nomination comes out, then you have the opportunity to nominate. The focal point has the opportunity or knows of experts that they can nominate who would be able to bring this varied perspective that we are talking about. And also in providing comments at the government level. So the IPCC also invites governments to provide comments, but you will find that the focal points naturally will not have the expertise for all of those. And so they consolidate experts in mitigation, in adaptation, and in the science of climate change so that they can provide robust comments back to the IPCC. So being known by your focal point in this case becomes useful because then you can be part of the development of government or national comments that go into the IPCC. I wanted to just briefly also share the process of preparing the IPCC reports, which then links back to why we need inclusivity or inclusion at an early level. So the beginning is the scoping. So this is the development of the outline, and this is developed by experts who've been nominated by governments and observer organizations, and then the approval of that outline. So if we miss an opportunity to have input at the scoping and approval, then it becomes very difficult to change anything once the cycle has begun. So it's very important that we have input at the scoping level and even at the approval of the outline level, which allows us then to identify opportunities to incorporate inclusivity into the outline. And therefore, authors who work on the report later can be able to find literature that is related to that. And also the nomination of authors happens after the approval of the outline. They are then selected, they start writing, and then we start now the review processes. So if we reach the end towards, for example, the government review of the final draft or the approval and acceptance, and we have not had inclusivity or inclusion taken into account, then it's a bit too late to do anything, which is why it's important to, in the early stages, ensure that there is inclusion or inclusivity. So I'll talk a little bit about this assessment cycle, the seventh one, and what opportunities it presents for us. We are starting from a point where we saw in AR6 we had limited representation or incomplete representation of disability in the adaptation and the mitigation pathways as well. And so how do we get to a point where we have robust adaptation pathways that have inclusion with them or inclusivity? So as I mentioned, we are developing an update to the technical guidelines on adaptation indicators and metrics. And so that presents an opportunity to incorporate disability disaggregated indicators. And so we could track vulnerability for specific groups at this point. We also have, with respect to the metrics, we could look at accessibility metrics and ensure that adaptation metrics are accessible themselves. And then with respect to mitigation, we model mitigation with inclusive assumptions. So part of our assumptions should capture the fact that societies have people living with disabilities who contribute meaningfully towards society. And so the mitigation pathways should incorporate that. And if it's sectoral, for example, at the infrastructural level, then we look at how inclusive infrastructure assumptions can be embedded in the modeling. Additionally, in this particular cycle, there is a very stronger emphasis on equity and justice. And this is from seeing how AR6 did not entirely capture that well. And so there is need to improve that. There is increased integration of diverse knowledge systems, and there are new methodological updates. And then, as I mentioned, the adaptation metrics. So all these provide an opportunity to be inclusive from the beginning. So I like to link what we're doing to justice, for example. So the IPCC, what it does or what it provides is not just for science, but it influences real life in different countries. So for example, the development of NDCs that countries do is influenced by the work of the IPCC. And so ensuring that the IPCC is as inclusive as possible then leads to an improvement in justice. And then also in adaptation planning, many countries rely on the work of the IPCC to plan the adaptation, to do the national adaptation plans. to see how to access finance, to see how to access funding for loss and damage, and even how to quantify these losses and damages. And also, global policy is influenced by the IPCC. And so, currently, because of there is some sort of invisibility in climate pathways. So you find that even when people are designing projects, most of them are not inclusive, and so funding does not absolutely cater to that. You find even with planning, there is planning invisibility, disabilities are not planned for, and even in implementation, so you find disability is not catered for at that level. And then that means then that the resilience of a community is impacted, the collective resilience, because crucial members of that society, of that community, are not included. And therefore, we cannot speak of resilience together when some are left behind. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyunguro, for a very wonderful and eye-opening presentation. And at least now we know some of the entry points. I see there are a lot of questions, but maybe I can start. I know you mentioned the now what you're working on is disability disaggregated data indicators. Sorry
Mhm.
about that. I wanted to find out how can organizations that work with people with disability and people with disability can be part of that process, especially now in Kenya. And also, if you can let our colleagues know in the region, because I've seen we have colleagues from Mauritania, we have colleagues from Uganda, we have colleagues from different regions, how they can link up with their focal points. And also, because I know this process is not just for Kenya, but it cuts across the global region, how they can be able to be part of it. I see colleagues from Nigeria, Seychelles, Rwanda. I think we have almost the continent present today. Yes. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. So let me just put in
and
chat.
also from Sierra Leone.
Thank
All
you,
right.
brother from Sierra Leone. Sorry
Yeah.
for not mentioning you. Okay.
So there, I've put a link in chat that shows the list of IPCC focal points, and that way you can be able to link up with your focal point in your country. I will also put a link to the website of the IPCC, which you can look at to see what reports have been done so far, and then yeah, see what is expected going forward. For your second question on how, particularly the development of the indicators, so I mentioned that we are working on the development of improved indicators for adaptation, and I said it's an opportunity to include disability indicators, not that it's already in there. But how you can be able to contribute, for example, there are various authors from different countries who are part of that and providing information that you have either of metrics or indicators that different organizations work with will support them in doing that. And I think you can reach out to perhaps Cynthia, me and you can work on that for the Kenyan part, but you can reach out to your national focal point and find out if there are any authors from your country who are selected who you can provide this information to.
All right. Thank you so much. We have questions on the chat, but I want to give opportunity to colleagues. If you're present and you posted a question on the chat, you can raise your hand and then we'll give you a chance to speak and then ask your question. I don't see any hand from my end. Colleagues, kindly, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, but I can go through the chat and read. Okay, I see we have Shannon Suman. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I'm Shannon, I'm from Seychelles. Um, Basically, I posted my question on the chat, but I can read it out here. So, what I wanted to know is, are there any resources or like funds or in terms of technical capacity available to countries to conduct any needs assessment or research on persons with disabilities and establish context-specific metrics? Because in Seychelles, it is quite limited. We haven't done a lot of studies on the communities. So yeah, any information on that would be very helpful.
Mhm. Yeah. So thanks for the question, Shannon. So from the IPCC perspective, funding that is provided is mainly for scholarships for students. And if a student, for example, is from Seychelles, applies for a scholarship and their research is based on providing baseline information, for example, I think that would be applicable. But the IPCC itself does not provide funding for research. I think there are other opportunities that can be explored for that kind of funding, but not from the IPCC for sure.
All right, thank you.
Hello, Patricia.
Hi, Florence.
Hi, my name is Florence from Samburu County. Thank you for the presentation. Mine is not a question, it's just a concern. Maybe for the link, you can help us share on a STREVOW WhatsApp group, or maybe Faith can help us share so that we can access it. Thank you.
Right. So Cynthia, I think you can share the link if there's a way, maybe your mailing list or something.
Yes, I will share the list. I'll share the links.
Mhm.
We have a question. Okay, Comrade Cynthia Bright, could you speak up if you can? If not, I'll read your
Okay.
question. All right.
Okay, thank you. I actually asked the question on the platform. I'm Comrade Cynthia. I'm the Executive Director of WEDO, Women Empowerment and Development Organization here in Nigeria. So what I asked was, what evidence does the IPCC provide regarding disability as a climate vulnerability factor? What are the evidences? And how do they carry out their monitoring processes on
All
how
right.
climate change affects their disability? Thank you.
Okay. So just to mention again, as a reminder, that the IPCC does not carry out its own research. It assesses existing research. So it would look at what researchers have worked on in the field of disability. Like I mentioned, the IPCC recognizes disability as a factor shaping climate vulnerability, but the treatment of it is uneven, and it's mostly qualitative, and it's concentrated in Working Group 2. So in Working Group 2, when we look at sections that deal with social vulnerability, equity and justice, health impacts, for example, urban risk, disaster risk reduction, and even limits to adaptation, it is highlighted in there. But in mitigation modeling, for example, or in construction of this shared socioeconomic pathways, it is not mentioned in there. I mentioned also that, so typically the IPCC defines risk as a factor of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. So within this framework, disability is treated as a social determinant of vulnerability. So together with age, gender, income, ethnicity, health status, and indigenous identity, for example. And it is described as increasing vulnerability due to reduced mobility, increased healthcare or care dependence, health sensitivity, limited access to information, and even barriers to evacuation and services. So there are specific parts within the AR6 that it's mentioned. So for example, on disproportionate disaster mortality. So people living with disabilities, there's higher mortality among them compared to others for extreme events such as heat waves, floods, and hurricanes. And then in heat stress and health, people living with certain disabilities are highlighted within the IPCC as being more sensitive to heat or even face compounded risk during power outages, for example. So it's in various ways that the IPCC deals with this and provides evidence that disability absolutely is a climate vulnerability factor or amplifies vulnerability.
Okay, thank you. There's a question on the chat box. You can please check it out if you don't mind.
It's okay. We'll read all the questions later. I just wanted to pick anybody who's raised their hand. We have Sharon, and then thereafter we'll look at all the questions in the chat. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all colleagues. Good mornings to all of you for those in different areas. My name is Sharon from ICASA, and I have a question. First of all, Patricia, thank you so much for your presentation and taking us through the IPCC and the process therein. I have a question on a matter that is quite common nowadays, and that is on mental health. And my question comes in, mental health is a social vulnerability. How has IPCC addressed this in any way, or is it that it has been addressed but in other quarters? Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. And interestingly, mental health is more developed in IPCC literature than disability, actually. But it's still uneven and it's concentrated on impacts research. So in AR6, we had specific chapters that were looking at health and extreme events, urban systems, human security, loss and damage, and even livelihoods and poverty. Those all addressed mental health issues. It looked at post-traumatic stress disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, increased suicide risk. And this is following some hazards such as floods, cyclones, wildfires, and heat waves as well. So mental health is actually dealt with more within the IPCC than disability, and there is within the AR7, now that AR6 is finished, within the AR7 there is concerted effort to include more on mental health, and particularly looking at, for example, even youth psychological distress, anxiety over the environment, and climate grief as well. But what you would notice is that in the African context, there is less regional specific information compared to other high-income countries. Again, it comes back to the fact that the research from the continent is relatively limited. We also have weak mental health data systems, and mental health is under prioritized in African countries systems as well. And so there is less evidence in AR6 from Africa. But going into AR7, because it's part of the outline, there is greater emphasis on including it, and we are looking to see that it is improved.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you. So I'll go to the chat. One of the key concern is will this slides be available for sharing later? That is one.
Oh yeah, I can share with you the slides, Cynthia, and then you can share them around.
All right, thank you. So the first question is from Roger Soching. He asked, how does the IPCC ensure that lived experiences of women with disabilities are reflected in its assessment reports, especially in
again, just to mention that the IPCC does not carry out its own research, and so someone working with people living with disabilities would have to have written on this and have published it and have it peer reviewed, and then the IPCC authors would be able to access it. There are an increasing number of funding agencies currently that are funding research on disability, health. The Wellcome Trust, for example, is one, and they've really focused in the recent past on the nexus between health and climate change. And there we have in the aspects of disability as an exacerbator of vulnerability. And so if researchers can take advantage of that opportunity to carry out specific research in this context, then it ensures that the IPCC can be able to have literature to assess, but they don't carry out their own research.
Okay. We have Joseph Etiang who asks, how are IPCC aligned adaptation strategies ensuring accessible early warning system, evacuation plans, and climate resilient health services for persons with disability?
All right. So as I mentioned earlier, again, within the sixth assessment cycle, which is the full complete cycle that we have, we had the IPCC addressing disabilities in very limited ways, particularly in the adaptation working group that deals with adaptation. And so in early warning systems, for example, there is the call or need for ensuring that early warnings are translated or made as inclusive as possible so that those who need to access them in good time to support, for example, immediate action. However, the treatment of disabilities is expected to improve within the seventh assessment cycle because it's recognized as being just beyond the vulnerability, but also interacting with exposure, for example, to determine how much more people are exposed to the hazards.
Okay. Justin Engole asks, does Africa have an IPCC in the pipeline? What are we doing to ensure that we tailor one?
So I hope I understand the question, and so I'm going to answer it this way. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a global body that is backed or supported by World Meteorological Organization and UNEP. So Africa cannot have its own IPCC, but Africa would participate within the current IPCC. And so what we are highlighting as a need here is for more inclusion of African experts in the processes of the IPCC, but also carrying out more research on the continent that would then make it into the assessments of the IPCC.
Okay, thank you. Justin Ngole, I hope your question was answered.
Yes, hello everyone.
Hello. Okay,
Patricia, thank you for your Patricia, thank you for your
yes, proceed. We can hear you.
okay. Yeah, she has partly answered my question, but then what I'm interested in is African solutions for African challenges. Because if you look at climate change, we have certain unique issues that affect us. So I wonder how far we have gone into incorporating it into that global standard that you're using. Or we still have a lot of work to do in that area. Thank you.
Okay, I think I understand it a bit better. We absolutely still have more to do. Like from the pictorial that I showed you, the number of African experts participating in the IPCC has been low, but is improving as each cycle progresses. But also because the IPCC does not carry out its own research, we need to carry out more research as Africans in areas that are useful or critical to us. So for this particular context, looking at how climate change interacts with disability and putting out research on that would allow information to be available for the IPCC to assess. But there is room for improvement. We are not there yet.
Okay, we have Msafiri Ngololo who asks, how is this realistic? How this is realistic apart from good written reports, as for instance, COVID-19, there was a great gap.
I think it's important for us to separate the role of the IPCC and the role of, for example, governments in implementing or utilizing the work of the IPCC to develop policy. So the IPCC's role, like we have mentioned, is to ensure that the latest science on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation is captured, is assessed, and is made available to policymakers. A gap may appear in how governments utilize this information or even whether they utilize it to develop robust policies. And I think there's a distinction there. So the reports are really good, and to be honest, they are very robust. They go through various approval processes, and they are very robust. Different countries have different processes that allow them to downscale that information and make it useful for their policymakers. And so once they do that, then it's on them at the country level, national or subnational level to implement them.
Thank you. And maybe just to add also, as you mentioned, that the reports inform the NDCs. So I think also there's an opportunity there to ensure that if disability is included in IPCC reports, then it trickles down to climate financing, NDCs, and other adaptive plans and action plans.
Yeah, very right, Cynthia. Thanks for adding that.
Roger Zucheng asked, how can CSO ensure that government uses IPCC recommendation design inclusive climate implementation?
Actually, this is a fantastic idea because, like I mentioned, the governments have access to this work of the IPCC, but then how they use them is dependent on their own national systems. And so CSOs would play an important role there, actually. So one way would be even developing policy briefs off of them, or even advocating for specific interventions that are inclusive, that are catering to the local context. So just raising the awareness of the availability of this information and how it can be useful for various contexts would be one way that CSOs can support or encourage government to use the work of the IPCC.
Thank you. We have Joseph Itiang ask, is climate financing earmarking specific resources for disability inclusive adaptation and mitigation? And how can DPOs access those funds?
What are DPOs?
I think DPOs are like
Disabled people's organizations.
Thank you.
Disabled people's organizations.
All right, thank you.
Are DPOs.
Yeah, I was actually very curious anyway, because I cannot answer this question because from the IPCC perspective, there is no financing that is earmarked for that. The one thing that the IPCC has done is early this year, there was a meeting on gender and social inclusion, and it looked at how the IPCC can incorporate or improve inclusivity at various levels. That's the extent of it. Any funding from the IPCC usually is for research, and it would be scholarships given to students from the global south or majority world, people living in Africa, various developing countries, and it's mainly for research. So the IPCC does not provide funding for actually implementing adaptation and mitigation actions.
Okay. We have Joseph Etiang again. How are communication strategies for climate risks, such as early warning system, being made accessible to deaf communities, especially in low resource settings?
I will give the example of Kenya. Recently, the Kenya Meteorological Department released its seasonal forecasts, and at the national release, there was translation, sign language translation. And this arose from the last last year we had within the room when we were releasing the forecast again, there are questions around inclusion and inclusivity. And so this was taken on board. And for the entire 2 days, I think it was, 2 days that we had the release of the forecast, there was sign language interpretation. There is definitely room for
Thank
improvement.
you.
For example, how we provide, so most of the forecasts that are provided by the Kenya Met Department we're not on TV, and so there is no sign language interpretation. But I feel like there is room for improvement even in the forecast that we provide to be more accessible. Yeah.
Also, maybe a question related to that, because most of the time, you realize most of the rooms where meetings are held or workshops are held are not disability friendly. So you find that even though people with disability are invited, their participation is not really well coordinated because they require a lot of coordination.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think you've answered the funding questions. We have so the main issue is also highlighted on the chart is the fact that many organizations of persons with disability are not able to access funding. Hence the need for capacity building and to organization of persons with disability on the research. So is there a way as a focal point you're able to advocate or help mobilize, whether within your networks or within the government, to be able to ensure that there are more calls for research-based, even within the Ministry of Environment, research on people with disability open to organizations with the persons with disabilities?
So I will take that as an idea actually of something that can be done. But in my role, my current role, it's not something that I have done or we've done within the IPCC. What we do is, for example, when we are designing country position within the government, we would make sure that we have perspectives from everyone, including people living with disabilities. And so this will support us in designing our country position when we go for negotiations. That is the extent to which I've seen this happen. But like you mentioned, I think that there's an opportunity to advocate for either funding or more research to be designed in such a way that it captures the perspectives or the lived experiences of people living with disabilities.
Thank you. We have in discussions around loss and damage, how are non-economic losses experienced by women with disability being assessed?
I will share with you about some work that is currently being done across Africa, looking at non-economic losses and damages. It is not specific to people living with disabilities currently, but it is looking at non-economic loss and damages. So it's looking at health, livelihoods, it's looking at heritage and culture, and the work is being done in the format being taken is it's looking at existing literature that has been published currently across the continent of Africa, and then looking at how non-economic losses and damages are captured. The aim of this is to provide robust information in one place, such that when the IPCC starts looking at it within this year, actually, then Africa can present a unified, available information that can be relied on. There is no specific emphasis or focus on people living or women living with disabilities.
Okay. If IPCC pathways aim to leave no one behind, what structural changes are needed to ensure persons with disabilities are embedded in climate science, policy design, and financing, not just referenced as vulnerable groups?
Fantastic question. Various ways. So, like I mentioned earlier, the IPCC at the beginning of this year held a global workshop that was looking at how to improve social inclusion within the work of the IPCC. And during that meeting, there were discussions around how to ensure that people who are living with disabilities and are experts in various areas within the climate change space are not nominated by their focal points to take part in all these processes, such as the scoping and even the developing of the reports themselves. And then thereafter, I think the responsibility also lies with governments, so that when governments have the work of the IPCC and they are looking to design policies based on that, part of the context would be also looking at how people living with disabilities are disproportionately impacted and how then designing policies with them in mind will contribute to overall resilience building. And like I mentioned, in AR7, in the seventh assessment cycle, also the IPCC is looking beyond looking at or treating disability just as a marker of vulnerability, but also looking at how people living with disabilities can contribute to change and how the disabilities can be modeled as part of mitigation pathways into the future.
Thank you. We have a question. It says, what mechanism used to ensure persons with disabilities preparedness, response, and recovery rather than remaining at the level of commitments on paper?
Again, that's a question for the national level, because the IPCC, again, just is not policy prescriptive. It provides relevant information that policymakers can rely on to develop their own policies. And so various mechanisms can be used. So, for example, co-producing of these policies at national and subnational level to include perspectives from people with disabilities who may be experts in the field themselves or whose lived experiences can be captured into the development of policy. So I have found that in my experience, if we want to capture diversified perspectives or diverse sources of knowledge, then co-producing that information is useful. So it's validated by all the members. It's an iterative process. It goes back and forth between those who are part of the co-production process. And in the end, you have a robust framework that ensures that these are captured. And then when implementation comes up, then it is actually done.
Thank you. Joseph Etiang has a challenge that learning basic sign language and being a sign language interpreter are not the same. True inclusion means respecting this difference and ensuring deaf individuals have access to qualified interpreters when accuracy and rights matter. And then we have Fatuma Haji, who mentions that currently there's drought in northeastern Kenya, and she mentions that persons living with disability are actually being hit hardest with that. But Daktari, I just wanted to come back to you. So in terms of action points, especially with the disability indicators and how persons with disability can reach out to their focal points at the national level. And then we see if maybe within the focal point system, maybe the focal points can host a regional dialogue or a regional meeting where persons with disability can see how they can best involve and maybe share ideas like a brainstorming session. So is this something that is feasible?
I think it is. It's something that we can work on. We need extra planning and reaching out to them. And you will also acknowledge that the interest may not be similar or the same across the region, but we can work on something like that.
Yes. Ruth mentions that at the beginning, climate project funding, that those who wish to share. Um, well, as I mentioned earlier when we were starting, we mentioned that within the STREVOW project, which is being implemented in 12 countries, there's an opportunity to come together for country dialogues. So country dialogues in a way to support within the project. So I wouldn't say that the funding is too much. No, it's just that we have country conveners within the African Alliance for Women with Disability, and my colleague Faith will be reaching out with more details on that. So we have the 12 countries that will be participating on that, and we'll be happy to hear your thoughts. And my colleague Faith will reach out to you. And we mentioned that if you want to be part of this conversation, you can share your email. And Faith shared her the contact details that need to be shared. But I saw that people also put it on the chat, so we'll also take it. Also, at this juncture, allow me to apologize to our French colleagues. Unfortunately, for this dialogue, we weren't able to get a French translator, but we'll ensure that we have French translation in the consecutive dialogues that we have. And then for our Kenyan colleagues, as Dr. Nguro mentioned, that we'll be reaching out with regards to the disability indicator. However, for our colleagues in other countries, because I see we have West Africa, we have Southern Africa, we have Eastern Africa present. We will share on email the link to the country focal points. Therefore, you can reach out to the country focal points within the same framework, because the framework is global, so it's happening at the national level, so that we are able to influence and have comprehensive disability indicators that can be used further in terms of assessment. Yes. So allow me to give Dr. Nyinguro to give us her parting shot and words of encouragement going forward. I think we still have a lot to learn in terms of how to influence the work of IPCC, especially people that work with people with disability and also persons with disability. So also as a focal point, how can we help you amplify and advocate for the work that you do? And also, how can we trickle down the information that you have at the grassroots level? So that's where we come in. So I just want to give you this opportunity to give us a parting shot. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. And before I do the parting shot, I would like to acknowledge someone has messaged me private. Just to mention that it's a reminder that people have disabilities, they do not live with disabilities. And so I will apologize for using that phrase throughout my entire talk. And I know better now, so I will definitely use people with disabilities. I would like to say that this was a fantastic opportunity to engage with you, and I appreciate the interest that there is in contributing to climate action at the global level collectively. I like to say that a lot of progress is achieved by everyone pulling their end or everyone doing their part. And so it's impossible for systems to move forward meaningfully without incorporating or including all perspectives. I look forward to engaging further if there is additional ways that I can be useful, perhaps even in providing linkages to other parts of government that may be more useful in implementation, for example. I would be happy to do that. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We don't take it for granted. Thank you. And colleagues, thank you for joining us today for this wonderful dialogue. And from ICASA and Semiride, we say thank you. And we also want to thank the African Climate Fund of the African Development Bank for also giving us an opportunity to have this one-of-a-kind project that actually look at strengthening the negotiation skills of women with disability in climate change processes. Thank you very much. Until next time, our next dialogue will be in March. I will be sending out emails soon. Thank you so much and goodbye.